Hello, welcome. We've made it to our last video in the nervous system chapter, and boy, we have covered a lot of information. This last video, I think, is the most interesting, just because the way that our body controls a lot of the stuff without us actually thinking about it, it's just so phenomenal to me. So this focuses on the autonomic nervous system, primarily the motor division of the autonomic nervous system. So if you go all the way back to the very first video of chapter 7, it talked about the organization of the nervous system. We had our afferent and efferent divisions. So of the efferent, we had the somatic, which only controlled skeletal muscle, and the autonomic that controlled smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So this whole video is going to be covering just that one box of that organizational flowchart, taking a look at how our autonomic nervous system controls your smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and secretory glands all over your body. What's kind of nice is the way that it's organized. These two divisions work kind of antagonistically. They oppose each other, but by doing so, it kind of covers all of the bases that we need depending on what's going on in our lives. So my first slide is going to do just an overview, kind of the big picture of the autonomic nervous system, and then we'll go into some of the details, kind of explaining why we have these different responses. So it's always great to bring in animals to help explain your topics. So the two divisions that make up the autonomic nervous system are what's called sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay. So sympathetic on the top here is referring to what we call fight or flight. So I'm focused, I guess, on both dogs here. Could be in that fight, one's in the fight mode and one's in the flight mode. So fight or flight is usually a short-lived crisis mode. Your body has to mobilize and either be ready to run away from a danger crisis or be able to fight during a danger crisis. Now there's other situations where sympathetic activation calls into play, but it doesn't quite fit into the rhyme. So we usually hear fight or flight, but also there's a third option called freeze. So sometimes when people are in sympathetic activation, they just stop. They're like frozen. The fourth one is a conscious initiation of this, which is exercise. So I say fight or flight or freeze or exercise. All of those conditions, whether that's the emergency crisis mode or you're deciding to exercise, will trigger all of these body's responses. So we see a heightened mental alertness. You're more aware of what's going on around you. Increased metabolic rate. Your cells are burning sugar and proteins at a faster rate and fats to be able to give you more ATP. We are reducing non-vital functions. So they don't stop altogether, but your digestive system slows down, your urinary system slows down. We activate any energy reserves that we have. So any stored fats are being released, any stored sugars are being released to help drive that increase in metabolic rate. You have an increase in respiratory rate and airflow into and out of your lungs. We have an increase in heart rate and blood pressure to circulate this more oxygenated blood around. And lastly, because we increase our metabolic activity and muscle contraction, we're going to increase our sweat glands to help cool our bodies down. So think about the last time you were in any one of these situations, fight or flight or freeze or exercise. Can you think back to your body doing all of these things? If you can internalize what you're learning, it really makes it a lot easier to describe and explain and understand. Now, the flip side to that is called the parasympathetic division. Okay, so this is what's happening with this little kitty here. The rhyme that goes with this one is rest and digest, or sometimes rest and repose, but people usually don't use the word repose very much anymore. So if we take a look at the things that are happening when you're in parasympathetic activation, it's almost the complete opposite. So we decrease our metabolic rate, we decrease our heart rate and blood pressure, we increase our digestive and urinary and defecation tracts, we reduce respiratory rate, we reduce, we store energy reserves because you usually have just eaten a meal. So again, think back to the last time you had a good meal and you kind of feel nice and cozy and warm. You just want to rest and take it easy. You're in parasympathetic activation, like full blown. But for the most part, we are almost always in parasympathetic activation. We don't spend a lot of time in sympathetic fight or flight mode because those are usually short-term emergency crisis situations. So even if you're at work and you didn't just eat, but you're just kind of your day-to-day, hour-by-hour activities, you're going to be in parasympathetic activation. Sympathetic is just kind of for those crisis emergency modes, lasts for a few minutes, and then you're back to parasympathetic division. So now that we have a general understanding of the difference between these two, let's take a look anatomically and physiologically what's happening in our bodies to allow us to have these different kinds of reactions. Okay. So before we can jump into the autonomic division, let's review our somatic nervous system. So remember, somatic is our conscious control using skeletal muscles. So what they've done here is they've kind of laid out the neuron pathways to get to our effectors. Remember, effectors are the things that allow us to do stuff. So they're like right here, all of this stuff here, these cell bodies of our neurons are located in the central nervous system, right? So the anterior gray horns of our spinal cord or gray matter in our brain. Doesn't matter, just any part of the central nervous system, you're going to have cell bodies. And then it branches off either from your brain, like in a cranial nerve, or branches off your spinal cord in a spinal nerve. And here's our peripheral nervous system. So here's our one axon. And then in the somatic nervous system, we reach our skeletal muscles. So think back to chapter 6, neuromuscular junction. Here's your acetylcholine communicating to your effector. You're going to contract your muscle. Voila, you have muscle contraction. Okay, so that's somatic motor. Now, when we take a look at the autonomic division, remember we have our two, sympathetic and parasympathetic. The first thing that you should notice is between central nervous system and effector, so I'll just kind of highlight the effectors here, we had one neuron up here in somatic division. Now take a look at those three boxes in the autonomic nervous system and see if you can see the major difference. Two neurons, and here we have some hormones. This is a special condition here. It's the weird one out. So we have two neurons. We have a first neuron called a preganglionic neuron or preganglionic fiber that communicates to what's called postganglionic. Well, what the heck's a ganglion? That's a weird word. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies. We saw one, the dorsal root ganglion, that hold the cell bodies of our sensory neurons. So this collection of where the preganglionic meets the postganglionic, that's the ganglion right here, that kind of yellowy structure. So the unique characteristics, the difference between somatic and autonomic and anatomically is your autonomic division has a two motor neuron pathway before we get to the destination. Okay, let's see if we can find some other differences. Take a look at the neurotransmitter. So here, oops, let me get back into my red. We had ACH, right? So it is ACH that was released at the synaptic cleft to tell the skeletal muscle what to do. Here, in sympathetic division, we have norepinephrine. It's a completely different hormone, or neurotransmitter, I should say. And then down here, in our parasympathetic division, we're back to acetylcholine. So even within the autonomic nervous system, we see some differences. We do see acetylcholine in that synapse between pre and post, so that's similar to our somatic division. But in this weird one, kind of in this middle box, we also see epinephrine being released into the bloodstream. Okay. So those are the major anatomical differences between your somatic, which is running your skeletal muscles, and your autonomic. So it is a two motor neuron pathway. And we see a variety of neurotransmitters. We see ACH, norepinephrine, and epinephrine is acting as a hormone. So because of these differences, primarily these differences in the signaling molecules, we are going to get some of those different responses. Okay. So now let's take a look at how these different divisions are split up between all of our body organs. So they're showing parasympathetic on the left, and they're showing sympathetic on the right. And a lot of times you'll notice the same organs are listed. So we have eye, salivary glands, heart, heart, lungs, lungs, stomach, stomach, pancreas, pancreas, liver and gallbladder, bladder, bladder, genitals, genitals. So really the only difference is the adrenal gland is found on the sympathetic side. And that's it. Everybody else, we have representation of both sides. So what does that mean? Well, think about the kitty and the puppy pictures. We had for, say, like the heart. The heart's a really easy one to use an example because we can really tell when our heart is beating fast. So when we are in sympathetic activation, the heart rate increases. So when that norepinephrine is being fired in that sympathetic pathway, the norepinephrine effects on the heart is to increase heart rate. Well, we go back to the parasympathetic side, flip back to that picture, it released acetylcholine, and that triggers the heart to decrease its activity, right? Now let's take a look at salivary glands. That's not quite as obvious, but think about when you're doing rest and digest, which is parasympathetic. So would you think that you're going to have more or less saliva being secreted when you're in rest and digest? Well, in this case, acetylcholine triggers an increase in salivary glands, and norepinephrine causes a decrease in salivary glands. Okay, what about your stomach activity? So let's say you're in fight or flight. Should you be actively digesting food in a crisis mode? No, so norepinephrine triggers a decrease in stomach activity, whereas in parasympathetic rest and digest, it's going to increase. So depending on what's needed, our body has a way to target those things. So skeletal muscles, increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, those are all going to be stimulated by the sympathetic division. Urinary function, digestive function, like processing your foods, saliva secretions, those are all going to be activated by your parasympathetic division. So what's kind of nice is this dual innervation allows each organ to be told what to do based on the situation that they're in. It's very quite efficient a way to kind of run things. The last thing I wanted to point out in this diagram is if you'll notice those preganglionic neurons, the ones that start off in the central nervous system, they are all located in the central part of the spinal cord between the thoracic and lumbar vertebra, where the parasympathetic is headquartered in the brain and the sacral part of the spinal cord. So they're physically in different places, and then they do those different things. Okay. Right. And then the last picture that your book shows kind of talking about this is just more like a roadmap. I'm not too concerned about you being able to recreate something like this. It just is showing you the various pathways that these pre and post ganglionic neurons can go to get to their destination. So let's say this is part of the sympathetic division, only the sympathetic is this way. Parasympathetic goes pretty much straight out to the organ, and then it communicates to its postganglionic fiber. So let's say you are sympathetic division and you need to slow down the small intestine. So your preganglionic neuron starts here in the what's called the lateral gray horn. It's part of the autonomic motor part of your gray matter. Goes out the ventral root, spinal nerve, through this little collection of nerves. This is called a splanchnic nerve. It's going to synapse with its postganglionic fiber in this ganglia, called a collateral ganglia, and then that's going to go out and tell the smooth muscle of the small intestine to slow down. Okay, so that's just one pathway that pre and post ganglionic neuron can take to get to where it needs to go. Let's say we need to go out to, say, the skin, sweat glands of the skin. So we'll do the same thing. We're going to follow this green one. So we're going to start here, preganglionic neuron out the ventral ramus, spinal nerve, and then we're going to synapse in this collection of cell bodies called the sympathetic chain ganglia. It's labeled over here. And then our postganglionic neuron is going to go right back out to that, like a ventral ramus, back out to a ulnar nerve, which is going to go out to my sweat glands here in my skin. So that's all this diagram is showing. Hopefully, don't let it overwhelm you because I know it can be a little bit confusing. But if you can take away, and the understanding from this is there are various pathways that those pre and post ganglionic neurons in the sympathetic division take, that's really all I'm looking for your understanding for this. All right. I think that's it. That wraps up our whole nervous system. So hopefully you enjoyed learning about your brain and your spinal cord and your autonomic nervous system and all of this big control system. That wraps up all the content from 121. As you prepare to go into 122 over the break or into fall term, you will be picking up with some of the other body systems. So I think you do your endocrine system, your lymphatic system, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive, the rest of those body systems that you learned about back in chapter 1. All right, it's been a pleasure working with you this summer. I wish you the best in the continuation of your studies and whatever program you're going for. All right, see you later. Bye.